Revolution of common sense.
Revolution of common sense.
A revolution of common sense.
Truth was once common sense, but today, truth is uncommon. Explore biblical truths around faith, business, and politics with Peter Demas. Uncommon sense in current times.
Hey folks, welcome to Uncommon Sense in Current Times. I'm excited to be here today with Todd Nettleton. He is the host of Voice of the Martyrs, which just recently turned 10 years old in September. So Todd, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So overall, Voice of the Martyrs, let's kind of talk about that. Like, what is the basic concept behind Voice of the Martyrs?
So Voice of the Martyrs is a ministry to persecuted Christians. We serve Christians in more than 70 countries where, maybe for being a Christian, you lose your job. Maybe your kids can't go to school. Maybe you get beaten up. Maybe you get killed. I mean, that does happen. And so Voice of the Martyrs seeks to serve those Christians in the places where they live, but then also here in America to tell their stories. And that's really my part of the ministry is just telling those stories, helping American Christians understand what's happening so that we can pray, so that we can be connected to brothers and sisters who are persecuted. One of the unique things about Voice of the Martyrs is our founders, Pastor Richard Wurmbrand and his wife Sabina, were persecuted Christians. Richard spent 14 years in prison. Sabina spent 3 years in prison. So when they founded the ministry to help persecuted Christians, they knew the kind of help they needed. They knew what it was like to be in those prison cells, and that's still part of our DNA 50-some years later.
So I think when Christians hear about persecuted Christians, we think of those extreme examples. We think of the images in Syria where people were crucified. We think of people going to jail for many periods of time. But you mentioned other things that fall under persecution. So how would you define persecution?
To me, persecution is when you're required to sacrifice something in order to follow Christ. And maybe the sacrifice is not your life. That does happen. Maybe it's a sacrifice as little, and it's little when it's not happening to you, right? Oh, sorry, you just had a little persecution. Well, they kicked my kids out of school, or I can't rent an apartment. Or what often happens in a Muslim context is the first line of persecution is your family members. It's your dad, it's your big brother, it's somebody coming to you and saying, listen, we're a Muslim family. Now you say you're not a Muslim. Well, you're not in our family anymore. We don't have room for you anymore. And so cutting off those family ties, that's definitely persecution. But it looks different in different parts of the world. And I think from our comfortable seat, we can say the severity is different. But when you're the one going through it, it's hard.
So, yeah, and I guess that's kind of, because even within the United States, so I'm from Tennessee. Tennessee, being a Christian is a relatively normal, even though they may not be a real Christian, but pretending to be a Christian at least is really normal. But versus if I were in, say, Oregon or California or parts of California, so persecution is obviously different from place to place. How do you pick and choose which places or which people to talk about?
We look at the severity of the persecution, and we look at how consistent it happens. If you're really persecuted in America, it's probably a pretty rare case. If you're really persecuted in northern Nigeria, yep, that's part of following Jesus in northern Nigeria. And so we look at the countries where it happens. It's the most severe and it's the most common. And that's where we really try to focus. And like I say, that's more than 70 countries around the world where it's severe enough and regular enough that we've identified them as a restricted nation or a hostile area where Christians are routinely persecuted for their faith in Christ.
And non-Christians, I get pushed back a lot when I talk about persecuted Christians, speak from non-Christians. Mm-hmm. Non-Christians say, y'all just make it up. It's not real. I mean, you're laughing as I even say it out loud. How do you respond to that? I mean, in spite of all the evidence out there, especially with all the information you have, how do you respond to that to non-Christians that do it, or do you even bother?
That's a great question. One of my frustrations as the media spokesperson for Voice of the Martyrs is it seems like in the secular media there's like one story a year of Christian persecution.
Right.
A couple years ago it was Pastor Andrew Brunson, an American pastor who was arrested in Turkey and put on trial. Now, that's real persecution, but that was the one story for that year. Like all the other stuff just sort of flowed under the radar and nobody covered that. A couple years before that, it was the girls in Nigeria that were kidnapped. And everybody talks about those girls in Nigeria. But, what about China? What about Iran? What about all these other places? I think someone who would say you're making that up is really just not paying attention. Like you need to look at what's happening in the world. You need to look at Afghanistan. You need to look at 400 plus Christians in prison in Eritrea. You need to know the name Pastor Wang Yi, who is serving a 9-year prison sentence in China. And then let's have a serious conversation about whether a Christian persecution is real or not.
So when you're looking at Christian, let's take China, for example. You're looking at Christian persecution in China. I know China allows a certain number of Christians there. They as long as they can be regulated. And now they're obviously changing the Bible to reflect more of their worldview.
Yeah.
But why is there certain things that people do in these countries that make them more of a target of persecuting besides just saying, hey, I'm a Christian, I showed up to this church today, or what is there seems to be a pattern, I guess.
That's a great question. I don't know that I could say there's a pattern, but I would say being a biblical follower of Jesus Christ who said, go into all the world and make disciples. So that's going to involve evangelism. That's going to involve discipleship. Those are the things that draw persecution. And oftentimes, if you sort of peel back the layers of the onion, what it comes down to is power and control.
Okay.
And so Xi Jinping, the president of China, he wants you as a Chinese citizen to wake up every morning and say to yourself, how can I serve the Communist Party today? What can I do today that will make me a good communist? Well, as followers of Christ, we wake up every morning and say, how can I please the Lord today? How can I grow in my faith today? Well, the Chinese Communist Party looks at that and says, well, that's a threat to us. Like all these people trying to be better Christians, that's not helping them be better communists. We need to crack down on this. We need to get control of this. And if you look at, you look at the communist mindset, you look oftentimes in an Islamic context, there's that element of control, that element of, this is not how we do things. This is going to upset the apple cart. We can't have that. So we have to crush that faith. We have to get that back under control. That's a lot of what drives persecution. Like I say, after you sort of get past the, what was the law or how did this happen? It's like, okay, well, this is about control.
It didn't really change much, I think, when you look at the Acts and you look at even, in the Gospels and in Acts, you see that the prevailing parties, whether it was Roman or Jewish, had the same issues. It was the jealousy, and then when they started spreading to the Gentile areas, the same thing. Well, in your opinion, why hasn't that changed? Because we've gone through so many different political structures and so many different, countries and different things like that. The Middle Ages, everything. Seems like it just seems to be the same thing over and over. What do you think is the source of it?
I think Satan is not that smart. He thinks I'm going to crush this. I'm going to crush the church, and it's never worked. It didn't work in the Book of Acts. It's not working in China. It's not working in Iran. There is something about persecution that helps a believer to experience God in a new and more powerful way. One of the stories I tell in my book is the story of a lady named Sister Tong. And so I went to China, and Sister Tong had just come out of 6 months in prison. And she had hosted a house church in her home. And at that time, they were raiding the house church. They'd take everybody's picture, write down all your details. But the person who owned the house, they went to jail.
Oh, wow.
And so Sister Tong had just been in prison for 6 months. We were there like 3 weeks after she got released. And so I'm sitting down with her, and I'm interviewing her. There's a translator there. And, I'm going to come back to America. I'm going to tell her story. So if you're going to tell a story, you need to start with the setting, right? It's a dark and stormy night. So I say, Sister Tong, tell me about the prison. And what I'm thinking is, tell me how big the rats were. Tell me how hard the bed was. Tell me how terrible the food was. Let's paint a picture.
Well, that was my image.
Right.
Yeah.
For my American audience, let's paint a picture of how terrible this prison was. And so the translator translates the question, and Sister Tong gets this huge smile on her face, like a heavenly smile. And she says something in Chinese, and the translator says, "Oh, yes, that was a wonderful time." And I looked at the translator. I'm like, I don't think you understood what, prison. I was asking him, prison. Yes, I understood you. Well, I don't think she understood then, because nobody would ever say prison is a wonderful time. Like, who says that? And he's like, no, she understood the question. And I'm like, okay, well, Sister Tong, you're going to have to explain yourself. Like, how can you say that was a wonderful time? She said two things. She said, Jesus was so close to me in that prison cell. I got to experience his presence in a way that I'd never have before. And she said, there were some ladies in my cell, and when I got there, they didn't know Jesus, but now they do. So Jesus was with me. Jesus gave me a ministry to do. Of course, that was a wonderful time. Like how could it not be a wonderful time? And that blew my mind. Like that totally blew my way of thinking about suffering and prison and persecution. Because if being in a Chinese prison for 6 months can be a wonderful time, then what is there in my life, what is there in your life that maybe you wouldn't want, like you wouldn't wish for it, but if Jesus is with you and Jesus gives you a ministry to do in the midst of that, that's a wonderful time. That's the challenge of Sister Tong, and I think that's why persecution spreads the gospel and builds people's faith, because they experience Christ in a different way.
So when you read in Acts, and after Acts, Acts 5, they get beaten, and the line that as you read it, they were like, rejoice because they got to suffer with Christ. And people read that casually, but in reality is I can't picture us sitting there saying, oh my goodness, look at this, my welt's bigger than your welt. I mean, I can't imagine that.
Right.
Is that kind of what you're talking about here?
Yeah.
That they can
I have
understand
had former Christian prisoners tell me that they miss prison because of the closeness of God and because of just the ministry that they saw happening. Now, they're not necessarily like, sign me up to go back.
Right.
But they're saying, I sometimes miss prison because of how my relationship with Christ was. I'll never forget a Sudanese pastor who spent several years in prison. And so he's telling me a story, and he said many nights in prison, they didn't have enough beds, and so he would sleep on the concrete floor. And he said, I would lay on the floor and I would weep. And I was like, as an American, I'm like, oh, because you missed your family, because the concrete floor was so uncomfortable. And he's like, no. I would weep because the presence of Christ was just so real. I didn't know how to respond other than to just weep tears of joy at the presence of Christ. And I was like, how do you, what do you say to that? It's like, right. So you're in prison weeping tears of joy. That's so counterintuitive.
So what can Americans take from this? Because we don't have that level of persecution. Persecution, and in my hometown is I didn't get invited to the Christmas party. I mean,
or an awkward conversation.
Yeah.
The conversation turned awkward when I talked about Jesus.
Yeah.
I was persecuted.
That's true. That's a big one I see. They asked me a question, I didn't know the answer. So when I'm looking at when I'm looking at that, when I think about that, and how
right there,
how do we translate some of this to Americans for them to understand and understand that suffering is part of this experience?
I think one thing is to emphasize the Scripture. As you look through the New Testament, and you mentioned the book of Acts, they left rejoicing that they were counted worthy. James says, do not be surprised, when you suffer. Peter writes about suffering. If you look at the New Testament, and Jesus himself said, the world hates me. If you follow me, the world will hate you too.
Right.
So I think understanding that scriptural call and the scriptural instruction is such a key part of that. The other thing I think, though, is knowing the stories of our brothers and sisters who are suffering and watching how they respond and watching how they forgive and how they love their enemies. We need to exercise our faith muscles a little more the way they do. Typically, an American lives on bi-weekly reliance on their paycheck, right?
Right.
On the 1st and the 15th, I'm going to get paid. That's how God's going to meet my needs. That's how my bills are going to get paid. That's how I'm going to survive. A Christian living in Eritrea or northern Nigeria wakes up every morning and says, Lord, if you don't show up today, I don't know how I'm going to get through the day. I don't know how this is all going to work. And so what happens is you pray that prayer in the morning, and then you see God show up in your day. And then the next morning you pray that same prayer, but you have more faith because you saw God yesterday.
Right.
And then the third morning you've seen him for 2 days. And so they live in that daily reliance on God, and they see God show up on a daily basis. And it just builds and strengthens their faith. We don't have to live that way because we live in a free country and because we're so blessed. but we need to learn how to exercise some of those faith muscles the way they do.
If of all the stories that you have and all the people that you've interviewed, and if there's one that you think would resonate the most with Christians who don't exercise their faith muscles on a regular basis, is there one that pops to your mind?
There are lots. One is the story of Hanali Gronwald. Her family, they moved to Afghanistan to serve the people there. The Taliban actually attacked their home. She was not home that day, but her husband and her 2 teenagers were killed. And I said to Hanali, I said, if I had asked you a year before this attack, if your faith was strong enough to go through that, would you have said, yeah, I'm ready? She said, no. She said, I never would have thought that. I would have told you there is absolutely no way I could go through that and my faith survive and still follow Christ and still believe. But she said, God gave me the grace to go through that. Even literally in the hours before the attack, God was strengthening her spirit and strengthening her heart. And the way she said it is she compared it to the boarding pass that you get to get on an airplane. You don't get your boarding pass a year before the flight. Like, hey, I'm going to fly in December, so I've got my boarding pass all printed out. No, you get your boarding pass when you go to the airport to get on the plane. She said, God's grace is like that boarding pass. When you're going to go through persecution, when you're going to go through that difficulty, He will give you the boarding pass. But it's not going to come real early. It's going to come right before you get on the plane. And she said, even in the hours before that, she experienced that. She experienced God strengthening her. And so I think one of the things that encourages me is if I'm afraid of persecution, and I kind of am, I don't want to be persecuted, to have that understanding and to have that confidence that, okay, if that's the Lord's path for me, and again, I hope it's not, but if that's the Lord's path for me, He will give me the grace to go through that.
So from that and from all that you've learned on it, and you said it, like, I don't want to go through it. I don't want to go through it either.
I hope best.
But if we aren't a threat to Satan, we won't get that persecution. So should we be sitting there saying we need to be more of a greater threat so that we need to rejoice more in that suffering so that we can have hope, all this stuff that's in there? Should our prayer life be changing more to almost ask for it even though we don't want it?
I don't know about asking for persecution, but I think we should ask for boldness. Lord, help me to be bold. Lord, help me to serve you. Lord, give me somebody today that I can talk to about Jesus and talk to about my faith. I think that's a good prayer. I'm hesitant to tell people to pray for persecution because the Lord might answer.
Right.
So,
okay. Well, so how do they find the Voice of the Martyrs? And then obviously you have some books as well. So how do they find out about that? Where do we go for all that?
Persecution.com is the main Voice of the Martyrs website. Persecution.com. Our podcast is at vomradio.net. So there's a website for the podcast, or wherever you listen to podcasts, you can find it there too. But the best place to start is persecution.com. We have a button at the top of the page that says free magazine. If you click that, fill out your name and address. Every month, we will send you stories of persecuted Christians so that you can pray by name and by place and by face and know who you're praying for, because that's the first request of persecuted Christians. So persecution.com, lots of resources to help you know these stories and help you pray.
That's awesome. I did not know about that free magazine, so I will definitely be signing up for that too. So thank you so much. I greatly appreciate you being on the show.
You're welcome.
Thank you again.
For having me.
All right.